So think about this for a second. If the person you were, say, 10 years ago is biologically and, psychologically dead.
Right, completely gone.
Yeah, exactly. If virtually every cell in your body has been replaced and your worldview has completely shifted, why do you still feel this crushing sense of guilt for a mistake that dead person made?
It really is wild.
Right. And conversely, why do you feel so entitled to the rewards that dead person earned?
Well, I mean, it's the ultimate cognitive dissonance of human existence. We viscerally feel like we're this continuous, unbroken thread stretching all the way from birth to death.
Mm-hmm.
But then, when we actually try to locate that thread, it just dissolves completely.
Which is exactly why we're opening up the clinic again today. So welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be back.
Now, since you, our listener, have already survived the really heavy deconstructive machinery of our previous sessions.
We've covered a lot.
We really have. I mean, we've analyzed causality, we completely dismantled the illusion of motion, and tore apart the mechanics of perception. So, you know the drill by now.
No beginner's orientation today.
Exactly. We are not doing hand-holding today. We are talking peer-to-peer, and we're stepping right into the absolute deep end.
The Mariana Trench of Buddhist philosophy, to be highly specific.
Yeah, pretty much.
Today we are tackling Chapter 12 of Nāgārjuna's Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, or the MMK.
The big one.
Yeah, this chapter is famously titled An Analysis of Sorrow, or in Sanskrit, Dukkha. And our mission today is to basically confront that exact paradox you just introduced.
Right, and we're taking a massive stack of materials into this deep dive. We've got the foundational verses of Chapter 12, plus multiple heavy-hitting translations from Garfield, Batchelor, Strang, the Padmakar translation group.
It's a lot of text.
It is, and we're using a very rigorous Madhyamaka diagnostic framework with 11 distinct steps. But really, everything we're looking at today circles around one core, unavoidable puzzle.
The proverb of karma.
Exactly. We all know it, right? You reap what you sow, action and consequence.
It sounds so simple.
It does. It seems like something you just slap on a bumper sticker. But when you put it under a philosophical microscope, the question immediately becomes, well, who exactly is doing the reaping?
Right, and that is the absolute terror that haunted early Buddhist philosophy.
Oh, totally.
I mean, if you posit that there's no permanent soul, no eternal Atman, which is, the absolute bedrock of Buddhist thought.
The whole foundation.
Yeah. Then how does a seed planted on a Tuesday blossom into a flower on a Friday?
Like, what's the connection?
Exactly. Is the personality, the specific configuration of the 5 aggregates of the person who produced the karma, the exact same continuous entity as the person who eventually reaps the fruit?
Or are they fundamentally inherently different?
Right. And before we can even begin to perform philosophical surgery on this problem, we need to understand the disease itself.
We need to look at how people tried to solve this before Nāgārjuna came along and, well, essentially burned the building down.
He really did.
Because in Nāgārjuna's time, the patient on the operating table was the Abhidharma schools, and they had a massive intellectual crisis on their hands.
They absolutely did. And honestly, you have to empathize with the Abhidharma scholars here.
Oh, for sure.
They were completely terrified of nihilism. They looked at the doctrine of no self and thought, well, if there is no continuous entity, then ethics just collapse.
Right. If the person who commits a crime today is not the same person who goes to jail tomorrow, then the moral law of the universe is just a sham.
Exactly. Society would literally fall apart.
So they needed a bridge. They needed something to carry the karma from the moment of the action to the moment of the result.
But they couldn't call it a soul.
Right, because the Buddha explicitly said there is no soul. So they engineered this really intricate workaround.
A very sophisticated, highly technical workaround. Depending on the specific Abhidharma tradition, they posited concepts like a stream of aggregates.
A skandha-santāna.
Yes, or later on, they came up with a kind of subtle foundational consciousness, the ālayavijñāna.
Okay, let's try to visualize this subtle consciousness for the listener, because it's actually a brilliant concept.
It really is.
When I read about the ālayavijñāna, the metaphor that always comes to mind is leaving a very strong perfume in a closed room.
Okay, I like that.
So the person wearing the perfume, representing the original action, leaves. They are entirely gone. The room is physically empty of the person.
Right.
But the scent lingers in the air. So the subtle consciousness acts like that air, holding on to the karmic scent or the karmic seeds until the conditions are right for them to ripen into an effect.
That is a perfect conventional metaphor for how they wanted it to work.
Yeah.
They argued that, sure, while there's no eternal, monolithic, unchanging soul with a capital S, There is this continuous, unbroken chain of moments of consciousness.
Like a carrier wave.
Exactly. One moment of consciousness conditions the exact next moment, transferring these karmic seeds down the line from the producer of the action to the reaper of the consequences.
And I have to be honest here, I really want to defend the Abhidharma monks for a second.
Fair enough.
Because that view makes absolute intuitive sense to me. Think of the classic Buddhist analogy of lighting one candle from another candle.
Right, the flame transfer.
Yeah, it's undeniably not the exact same physical flame, but there is this obvious, undeniable causal continuity. The fire transfers.
It does.
So it feels like a perfectly logical, elegant way to explain how karma works without requiring a permanent soul. Why does Nāgārjuna look at this stream or this subtle consciousness and diagnose it as a fatal philosophical disease?
Well, he diagnoses it as a disease because he sees exactly what they're doing under the table.
What are they doing?
It's a highly intellectualized, desperate attempt to smuggle an inherently existing identity right through the back door.
Ah, so they're smuggling in essence, like they just shrunk the soul down so small they hope nobody would notice.
That's a great way to put it. They stripped away the gross, obvious concept of an eternal soul, but they replaced it with a microscopic, momentary, but fundamentally real building block.
Right.
They basically assumed that for a cause to link to an effect, there must be a wire connecting them, a real inherently existing wire, a continuous stream. Nāgārjuna sees this and realizes that if you grant them even a microscopic drop of inherent existence, of absolute continuity, the entire system of dependent origination just freezes solid.
Okay, so to dismantle the smuggled identity, we have to start with step 1 of our 11-step framework. Nāgārjuna demands that we map our experience onto the 3 spheres of this specific causality.
The triad.
Right. If we were going to look at the production of suffering, we have to look at the triad.
The triad is the baseline of our whole analysis. So sphere number 1 is the actor or the producer. This is the configuration of the 5 aggregates before the event.
5 aggregates before.
Sphere number 2 is the action itself, the actual production of the karma or the suffering. And then sphere number 3 is the result, the reaper. The 5 aggregates after the event experiencing the suffering.
So the producer, the production, and the product. We've got the Abhidharma's supposed continuous stream trying to connect these 3 spheres.
Yeah.
Now we deploy the heavy machinery. We move to step 2. We drop this triad into the crucible of Nāgārjuna's 4-cornered logic, the tetralemma, across the first 9 verses of chapter 12.
We have to rigorously test the relationship between the producer and the reaper.
So let's walk down the first corridor. Horn 1 of the tetralemma. Self-produced.
Oh, right. This is the argument for absolute continuity or absolute identity. The opponent steps up and says, well, the 5 aggregates before that produce the karma, and the 5 aggregates after that reap the consequences, are inherently identical. They're part of the exact same absolute self-produced continuum.
And honestly, on the surface, this is how most of us live our lives, isn't it?
Lovely. Yeah.
I say, I am me. The me who stole the candy bar at age 5 is the exact same me who is feeling guilty about it at age 35.
Feels true intuitively.
But Nāgārjuna's refutation in verses 1 and 2 is absolutely surgical here. He basically states that if suffering came from itself, it would not arise dependently.
Exactly.
If the producer is inherently absolutely identical to the reaper, causality literally freezes in place.
We really have to lean into what the word inherent means in Madhyamaka philosophy here, because it's the linchpin of the whole argument.
It's super important.
If something possesses inherent existence, svabhāva, it means it exists entirely under its own power. It is independent, immutable, and requires no external conditions to be exactly what it is.
It's absolutely complete. It doesn't need a past or a future. It just is.
Precisely. Now think about the physics of that stasis. Imagine a seed. If a seed possesses absolute inherent seedness, it can never be influenced by anything outside of itself.
Right.
It is essentially a microscopic, impenetrable steel ball bearing. For a sprout to emerge, the seed must break down. It must decay. It must cease to be a seed.
So it has to be incredibly vulnerable to the soil, the water, and the sunlight. So if you plant a steel ball bearing, an inherently existent seed, you can water it for 1,000 years, you can shine all the sunlight in the universe on it, and it will literally never sprout.
Never.
It cannot transform because its identity is locked.
And you apply that directly to the personality. If the personality of the producer is absolute and identical to the personality of the reaper, no transformation can occur.
Right.
If the 5 aggregates before are inherently identical to the 5 aggregates after, then the production of a new karmic effect is totally redundant. You cannot build a house that is already fully built.
So if I am inherently identical to my past self, I can never actually experience a new consequence. I can never suffer because suffering requires a change of state.
You have to go from one state to another.
Right. I go from a state of non-suffering to a state of suffering. But if my identity is absolute, I can't change states.
And beyond that, if a cause is inherently identical to its effect, you get this grotesque, logical, infinite regress. The seed produces a seed, which produces a seed without ever becoming a sprout.
Just an endless loop of seeds.
The producer produces the producer. The action never yields a result different from itself. Absolute continuity results in a frozen, static universe where nothing can ever happen. So Horn 1 completely fails. Identity is a dead end.
Which forces the opponent to run in a panic to the opposite extreme. So we hit Horn 2 of the tetralemma.
Yeah.
Other produced.
Yes.
If the producer and the reaper aren't the same, well, they must be completely different. This is the argument for absolute discontinuity. The 5 aggregates before are entirely inherently different from the 5 aggregates after.
Right. So the opponent thinks they've escaped the trap of the frozen universe. They say, okay, fine, things change. The self that commits the act is extinguished, and a brand new, inherently distinct self arises to reap the consequences.
But wait, hold on. If the person who commits the crime is inherently absolutely different from the person who goes to jail for it,
Then what happens?
we are right back to the Abhidharma's worst nightmare. The entire moral law of karma just broke down. It means a total stranger is suffering for my actions.
That is exactly the catastrophe Nāgārjuna points out in verses 3, 5, and 6. If the aggregates that went before are totally alien to the ones present now, the karmic link is violently severed.
I like to think about it like digital data. If I want to send a file from my laptop to a printer, there has to be a connection, either a physical hardwire or a Wi-Fi signal, a continuum.
There has to be a medium.
Exactly. But absolute discontinuity means there is no connection whatsoever. It's like typing a document on your laptop in New York and just hoping it magically prints out of a disconnected toaster in Tokyo.
That's a brilliant way to conceptualize the void between them.
If there is absolute discontinuity, there's no mechanism for the data of your karma to travel from the cause to the effect.
Because if absolute difference were true, anything could cause anything. The universe just becomes a chaotic mess of disconnected, floating billiard balls that can never actually influence each other.
Right.
Planting a rock could grow an oak tree. A single drop of water could start a massive forest fire.
Because if the cause and the effect are absolutely distinct, there's literally no reason this specific cause should produce this specific effect.
Right. And ethically, it's just horrifying. Your neighbor's bad actions could suddenly cause you to experience karmic suffering.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
In verse 6, Nāgārjuna essentially asks, if suffering comes from another person, who is the distinct person bestowing it? If the reaper is entirely distinct from the producer, then the reaper is just sitting there, completely independent, and suffering is suddenly dropped on their head from an alien source.
You would just be suffering consequences you never generated. It's a universe of absolute injustice. So absolute discontinuity destroys the mechanics of karma just as thoroughly as absolute continuity did.
Identity fails because it freezes everything. Difference fails because it shatters everything into disconnected fragments.
So what about Horn 3? The opponent gets desperate and tries to combine them. Can the producer and the reaper be both identical and different?
This is the chimera. It's a very common philosophical retreat when people get backed into a corner.
For sure.
They say, well, it's a little bit of both. The stream of consciousness is somewhat the same, which allows karma to travel, but it's somewhat different, which allows for change.
I mean, it sounds like a reasonable everyday compromise. Why doesn't Nāgārjuna just accept that?
Because in Madhyamaka logic, you are not allowed to be intellectually cowardly. Verses 7 and 8 dismantle this completely. You cannot combine two absolute failures and magically manufacture a success.
Let's walk through the actual logic of those verses, because it's not just some semantic trick. Why exactly is it a contradiction?
Because remember, we're dealing with absolute inherent natures here.
Right.
Inherent identity means 100% self-contained stasis. Inherent difference means 100% alien disconnection. You are demanding that reality accommodate two entirely opposed absolute states at the exact same time in the exact same respect within the same phenomenon.
It's like saying a light switch is 100% objectively on N and 100% objectively off F simultaneously. You can string the words together in a sentence and say, it is both identical and different. but conceptually, it is a catastrophic system failure.
It just doesn't work.
If a part of the self is absolutely identical, that part is frozen and can't produce karma. If another part is absolutely different, that part is severed and can't transmit karma. Gluing a frozen gear to a missing gear doesn't make an engine run.
That's spot on. Mixing two logical absurdities doesn't create a truth. Nāgārjuna says that if either self-production or other production were established individually, well, you might be able to combine them. But since both have been proven impossible, their combination is doubly impossible.
Which leaves the really desperate, nihilistic final corner, horn 4, neither. The relationship is neither identical nor different. The suffering is simply uncaused.
And verse 9 dismisses this final refuge with almost brutal brevity. Nāgārjuna just writes, "Not caused by self or by other. How could suffering be uncaused?"
Basically, if things just happen randomly without any causes or conditions, then the entire structure of reality just collapses.
If you claim suffering is completely uncaused, you're denying the foundational Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination entirely.
You're throwing the whole thing out.
You're saying things just pop into existence randomly out of the void. Your suffering today has absolutely no connection to anything you did or anything anyone else did or any environmental condition. It just spontaneously manifested.
Wow.
That reduces the universe to pure, unpredictable chaos. Ethics, science, basic daily functioning, it all relies on causality.
So the tetralemma crucible has done its work. It has burned away every possible absolute conceptualization. The four corners, self-produced, other-produced, both, and neither, have all collapsed into total absurdity.
It's all gone.
So where does that leave us? Are we just left floating in a void? Does the universe just break?
Well, this is the moment of breakthrough, really. Moving to step 3 of our framework. Because the tetralemma leaves no survivors, we are forced to accept a radical new paradigm. We must conclude that there is absolutely zero inherent continuity and absolutely zero inherent discontinuity of any self, any continuum, or any chain of consciousness from the moment karma is produced to the moment it is suffered.
So the three spheres, the producer, the production, and the reaper, possess zero svabhāva. They are completely empty of inherent existence. They are never absolute.
Never.
And this is where we have to be incredibly careful, because when people hear emptiness, they immediately think of nothingness. They think Nāgārjuna is saying the self doesn't exist at all, or that suffering isn't real.
And that is the trap of nihilism, which is just as dangerous as eternalism. Emptiness is not a dark, terrifying void.
Right.
Emptiness simply means things lack a fixed, standalone, independent essence. It means things do not exist from their own side.
So if they don't exist inherently, how do they exist? This is step 4. If there is no absolute wire connecting my past self to my future self, how do I actually experience the cycle of rebirth?
It's a great question.
How do I even maintain a daily habit? If the cause doesn't physically push the effect, like a billiard ball, how does the universe actually function?
If things don't exist absolutely, they can only exist relationally. This is the profound pivot to dependent origination.
Oh, okay.
The 3 spheres of karma, actor, action, and result are inseparable. They are dependently co-originated, interdependent, co-defined, and co-evolving.
Let's map this out practically, because this is where the philosophy becomes incredibly dynamic. We are no longer looking at a straight linear timeline where A causes B and B causes C. We are looking at a centerless fractal loop, a conditioned conditioning process.
Let's trace a specific karmic cycle through this relational loop. Imagine a person, the producer of karma. Let's say it's someone who struggles with deep-seated anger.
Okay, got it.
They don't arrive in the present moment as a blank slate or a static inherent soul. They arrive as a heavily conditioned producer. Their configuration of the 5 aggregates right now is the result of countless past biological, environmental, and mental conditions.
So they are carrying the baggage of their dependent origination. Their anger is their current operating system. That's their 5 aggregates before.
Exactly. Now, this conditioned producer encounters a trigger, say a minor disagreement with a colleague, and they decide to act.
Right.
But their action isn't an isolated, independent event. It is a conditioning action, heavily shaped by their specific angry state. So they yell at their colleague.
They produce the karma, the action of suffering. That's sphere number 2.
Yes, and that angry action generates a result, a product. The colleague withdraws, the workplace becomes hostile, and our producer is alienated.
So that alienation is the reaper, the 5 aggregates after experiencing the suffering of isolation. Sphere number 3.
But here's the critical part. the loop doesn't stop there.
Right. The result instantly feeds backward. The suffering of alienation updates the producer's conditioning. The isolation reinforces the internal anger and paranoia, making the producer even more conditioned.
Which makes him even more likely to lash out defensively in the exact next interaction.
It is an infinite, unbreakable circuit, an Ouroboros. The action updates the result, which instantaneously updates the producer for the next action. There is no original prime mover starting the chain, and there is no final static destination.
And most importantly, none of those three spheres can exist independently. You cannot have a producer without an action to produce.
That makes sense.
The very millisecond the action occurs, the producer is simultaneously brought into existence as a conceptual reality.
It's like the concept of a parent and a child. A person might exist for 30 years, but they are not inherently a parent. The exact millisecond the child is born, the parent is simultaneously created. The identities are co-created by the relationship.
They're entirely co-defined. The spheres of actor, action, and result are mere conceptual designations. They're useful linguistic labels. Our minds apply to a constantly flowing, fluid, ungraspable process.
Which brings us to step 5, a massive realization about how reality is structured in Madhyamaka, the union of the two truths. Because we have two things happening simultaneously. We have conventional truth, which is dependent origination, the cause and effect loop functioning flawlessly in our daily lives. The anger genuinely causes the alienation.
Right.
And we have the ultimate truth, which is emptiness, the total lack of any solid inherent essence in the angry person or the alienation.
The absolute genius of Nāgārjuna is realizing that these two truths are not in conflict. In fact, one truth completely supports, implies, and energizes the other.
How so?
The conventional truth of karma functions flawlessly only because of the ultimate truth of emptiness.
Wow, let that sink in for a second. Because if the aggregates were solid, absolute steel ball bearings, like we said earlier, karma couldn't function.
Not at all.
If my anger was an absolute, unchanging, inherent essence residing inside me, I could never heal, I could never apologize, I would be locked in a permanent state of rage. Emptiness is the necessary flexibility that actually allows the karmic loop to turn.
They can dance only because they're empty. Emptiness is not the destruction of causality. It is the absolute prerequisite for causality.
That's powerful.
We established earlier that we aren't doing a beginner's dive into the emptiness of emptiness today. We're treating the union of the two truths as our baseline. But the crucial takeaway is that the producer and the reaper are empty because they dependently arise. And they dependently arise because they are empty.
So we've taken the Abhidharma patient through the crucible. The absolute continuous self is completely dissolved, replaced by this breathtaking, dynamic fractal loop of conditions, which shifts our analysis into step 6, a space that moves from strict logic into almost poetry.
It really does. Nāgārjuna concludes that because these three spheres are an empty, co-arising loop, their nature is deeply paradoxical to the unenlightened mind.
Right.
They are functionally there, yet not there. The texts frequently describe them as illusory, like mirages, dreams, reflections in a mirror, or echoes.
I really want to unpack that echo analogy because when Westerners hear the word illusion, they immediately think of a stage magician or a literal hallucination.
They think it means completely fake or non-existent.
Exactly. But an echo is a perfect, precise metaphor for karmic reality.
Walk us through the mechanics of the echo.
Well, if I stand in a massive canyon and I yell, the echo functions flawlessly in conventional reality. It is dependently originated by a very specific set of conditions. My vocal cords, the shape of the rock wall, the humidity in the air, the distance. The sound waves physically bounce off the rock. They travel back to my ear. They might even physically startle a flock of birds into the air.
It has undeniable, measurable causal impact.
Exactly. It creates a real effect. But if I try to reach out and physically grab the echo, if I try to find the inherent essence of the echo, my hand just closes on empty air.
Right, there's nothing solid there.
It has no solid physical core. It is an event, a temporary confluence of conditions. It is there, yet not there. Karma, the self, the cycle of suffering, they're all functional echoes.
That is precisely what Nāgārjuna means by illusory. They function without essence. But this is where Nāgārjuna drops an absolute bomb on his readers. Moving to step 7.
Here we go.
Verse 10 of chapter 12 takes a massive, universe-expanding right turn.
Yeah, up until now, we've been relatively comfortable because we've been analyzing internal psychological phenomena, the personality, suffering, the ego, karma.
It's manageable.
It is. It's relatively easy to accept that my psychology is a fluid, empty process. But Verse 10 extends this exact same tetralemma logic to hava.
Hava.
Yeah.
All existing things.
Yeah.
All conditioned phenomena. External physical objects, universal laws, spatial dimensions, conceptual frameworks.
Everything.
He broadens the scope of emptiness to encompass the entire physical universe.
And here is where I have to push back hard, because this is where Madhyamaka starts to sound completely insane to the average person.
I get that.
I can accept that myself is a karmic mirage constantly updating itself. But what about the solid external world? What about this heavy oak table holding my coffee cup right now? Or a fundamental physical law like gravity?
Or a subatomic proton.
Exactly. Those things undeniably persist. If I leave the room and come back tomorrow, the table is still there. How can Nāgārjuna possibly say a table isn't continuous from yesterday to today? It feels absurd to call a heavy piece of furniture an echo.
It feels absurd because of our deep, instinctual, biological and cultural conditioning. Our brains are hardwired to perceive solid objects for simple survival.
Sure.
But let's take your oak table and apply the generalized tetralemma to it. We must rigorously test if the table is this, meaning inherently continuous, singular, and existent, or non-this, meaning inherently discontinuous and non-existent, or both, or neither.
Okay, let's run the diagnostic on the table. Horn 1. Is the table inherently continuous and existent? Is it this?
Well, if the table were inherently existent and continuous, it would possess an enduring, self-sustaining identity that exists completely independently of its parts, its environment, or the human mind perceiving it.
It would have absolute tableness.
Right. But look closely at the table. It is entirely dependent on an infinite web of non-table elements.
The wood, the metal nails, the varnish.
Yes. And it's dependent on the labor of the carpenter. It's dependent on the specific environmental humidity keeping the wood from warping or splintering.
Mm-hmm.
If you take away the wood and the nails, does the table still exist?
No, obviously the physical structure is gone. But wait, if you take away the wood, you don't just lose the label, you lose the physical space it occupies. It's not just an idea in my head, it's a literal collision of atoms.
But what are those atoms? Quantum physics tells us they're mostly empty space, temporary fluctuations in a quantum field.
Okay, true.
But even staying on the macro level, the table is heavily dependent on conceptual imputation.
Mm-hmm.
The tableness is a label your human mind projects onto that specific arrangement of wood and nails, because it serves a function for your specific body. It holds your coffee cup at a convenient height.
Right. If a termite looks at that exact same arrangement of atoms, it doesn't see a table to hold a cup. It sees a food source. It sees lunch.
Exactly.
If an alien made of pure energy floats through the room, it sees an obstacle of dense matter.
And if we view the table on a geological timescale of, say, 1,000,000 years, it isn't a table at all.
Mm.
It's a tree that grew, was cut down, briefly held a shape for a few decades, and then rotted away into dust that blew across the earth.
Wow.
It is a temporary, hyper-specific event, not an eternal truth.
It's an event that is currently happening very slowly.
Yes.
So it cannot be inherently continuous. It is not this. What about horn 2? Is it inherently discontinuous or non-existent? Is it non-this?
If it were inherently non-existent, it would lack any causal connection to its parts or to you. It would be entirely nothing.
But we know it does have a causal connection. It functions conventionally. It is currently holding my coffee cup. If I walk into it in the dark, I will absolutely bruise my shin.
Right.
So it is not entirely non-existent. It is not non-this.
And just like with the karma triad, we know it can't be both inherently real and inherently unreal, because that's a logical contradiction.
And it can't be neither, because then it would exist completely independent of causes just popping in and out of the void.
The generalized tetralemma strips the absolute reality away from the physical world, just as ruthlessly as it did the psychological world. The table only appears continuous to you because of its consistent function, your conceptual labeling, and your biological limits of perception. But in ultimate reality, it is completely empty of absolute continuous substance. Reality, whether internal karma or external oak tables, transcends all conditioned, dualistic conceptual proliferation.
Prapanka. The exhausting, relentless human need to categorize the universe into neat, absolute little boxes. Good, bad, self, other, table, not table.
Nāgārjuna is systematically taking all the boxes away.
Which leads us directly to step 9, the philosophical stance we must adopt in the face of this centerless, empty, fractal universe, the stance that defines this entire tradition, the middle way.
And we really need to be incredibly precise about what the middle way actually means here.
We do, because in the West, we hear the word middle and we instantly think of a compromise, like setting a thermostat. If you want the room at 80 degrees and I want it at 60 degrees, the middle way is setting it to 70. It's this lukewarm, diplomatic compromise between two extremes.
That is exactly what the Madhyamaka middle way is not. It's not a blending of extremes. It is a radical cognitive stance that is entirely free from the spectrum itself.
It drops the thermostat completely out the window.
Exactly. It transcends objectivism and realism, the idea that the table or the self has an absolute independent reality. And it completely transcends nihilism, the idea that nothing exists and nothing matters, so we might as well just give up.
It also transcends pluralism, the idea that the universe is made of fundamentally separate, disconnected parts.
Yes.
And crucially, it transcends monoidism, the idea that everything is just one giant, undifferentiated cosmic blob where all distinctions are magically erased.
It is a stance where there is absolutely nothing to accept or seek in absolute terms, and absolutely nothing to reject or abandon. You stop fighting to make the mirage solid. You let the echo be an echo.
But this philosophical altitude, this radical non-attachment to absolute concepts, it naturally begs a very pragmatic question. Which brings us to step 10 of our analysis, the application. Boots on the ground.
The rubber meets the road question.
Yes, because it is incredibly easy to sit in a meditation hall or a studio and talk about empty holograms. But if I am essentially a karmic mirage, interacting with a universe of other mirages, and I'm not supposed to cling to any absolute concepts, how do I actually live my life tomorrow morning?
Right.
How do I navigate a high-stakes corporate meeting where millions of dollars are on the line? Or what happens when someone aggressively cuts me off in gridlock traffic on my commute? I can't just float through the world telling everyone they are empty echoes.
No, you absolutely cannot. If you let someone crash into your car because you think they're a hologram, you have fallen off the bicycle of the middle way straight into the ditch of nihilism.
That's a great image.
The application of this philosophy is called acting without acting.
Acting without acting. I mean, it sounds like a Taoist paradox. What does it actually look like in practice?
It means you use the tools of conventional reality, the actor, the action, the result, but you never reify them into absolute terms. You engage fully, passionately, and skillfully with dependent origination, but entirely without the agonizing effort of trying to maintain absolute identities.
Let's play this out with the traffic jam scenario. I'm driving to work. Someone recklessly swerves into my lane, nearly sideswiping me. Conventionally, what do I do?
Conventionally, you slam on the brakes, you grip the wheel, you respect the laws of physics and the mechanics of dependent origination to survive the encounter. You use the tools of actor and action flawlessly.
But usually a microsecond after I hit the brakes, my mind goes into total overdrive.
Right.
It builds a rigid, absolute triad. I reify the event. I instantly become the absolute innocent victim. The cutoff becomes an absolute evil, intentional action directed specifically at me. And the other driver becomes an absolute, unforgivable villain.
Which is exhausting.
Totally. And from that rigid conceptual triad, my heart rate spikes, my blood pressure goes through the roof, and I am consumed by road rage. My whole day is ruined because I'm carrying this villain around in my head.
Exactly. You took a fleeting collision of empty, dependently originated conditions, and you violently froze them into an absolute moral drama.
Right.
But acting without acting needs you break to survive conventionally, but you actively refuse to reify that driver into an absolute villain.
Because I recognize that they, too, are an empty, dependently originated nexus of conditions.
You don't know their causes.
Right. Maybe they are rushing a sick child to the hospital. Maybe they are having a panic attack, or they're exhausted from working 3 jobs, or maybe they're just conventionally careless. But there is no absolute inherent villainness residing inside their car.
And equally important, you refuse to reify yourself into an absolute permanent victim. You allow yourself to experience the biological adrenaline of the near miss, that is conventional reality. But you don't cling to the anger, because you realize there is no absolute target out there to be angry at, and no absolute self in here to defend. You act skillfully, you stay safe, but you wear the world lightly.
I really love that phrase, wearing the world lightly. What about the corporate meeting, the high-stakes negotiation where I have to win a contract?
It's the exact same application. You prepare the PowerPoint deck, you study the numbers late into the night, you argue your points fiercely and passionately in the boardroom.
So I don't just sit there passively.
Not at all. You respect dependent origination because if you don't prepare the conditions, the causal result will dictate that you fail to pitch. You play the game with total commitment.
But I play it knowing it's a game. If I win the contract, I celebrate conventionally, I enjoy the success, but my ego doesn't inflate into some narcissistic monster because I know the victory is entirely conditional.
It depends on 1,000 factors outside your control.
It doesn't define my absolute worth.
And if you lose the contract to a rival firm,
I feel the conventional disappointment. It stings. But it doesn't shatter my core. I don't suffer the agonizing existential despair of a broken identity, because I knew from the start that the negotiation, and the contract were just a fluid dance of conditions. I don't take it personally because there is no absolute person for it to happen to.
that is acting without acting. And when you master this, when you can truly rest in the world without reifying it, a profound perceptual shift occurs.
Step 11.
Yes. This is the culmination of our analysis, primordial purity and suchness, or tathata.
The ultimate shift.
When you drop the absolute categorizations, when you stop fighting to make the echo solid, you begin to perceive everything. Every actor, every action, every result, every wooden table, every infuriating traffic jam.
You perceive them as what?
As primordially equal, pure, perfect, and complete, just as it is.
But we have to be careful with the word one or unity here, don't we?
We do.
We perceive reality as a unified field, but strictly in the non-dual sense of our generalized tetralemma. It is not many disconnected parts, but it is also not one giant featureless blob. It is not both and not neither. It is an inconceivable, boundless, dynamic interdependence.
Yes. And if we connect this to the ethical extrapolation of this entire philosophy, it completely redefines the concept of compassion.
This is where the physics of emptiness becomes so beautiful to me.
Yeah.
Because if the perceiver and the perceived intimately co-create each other, if the producer and the reaper are an inseparable, continuous loop,
Then the hard, absolute borderline between you and the rest of the cosmos completely dissolves.
there is no absolute borderline. Your identity is literally defined by your interaction with your environment, and the environment is defined by its interaction with you. You are part of the exact same breath.
Which means compassion isn't some heavy, burdensome moral duty.
Right.
It's not a religious commandment you have to grit your teeth and obey because a deity told you to be nice. It's basic physics.
It is fundamental physics.
Yeah.
Because if there is no absolute boundary between self and other, inflicting suffering on someone else is causally injecting poison into the very environmental fractal that is instantaneously looping back to update your own perception.
Exactly.
Hurting them is literally hurting the matrix that sustains you.
It's as instinctual and logical as your left hand pulling your right hand out of a fire.
I love that.
Your left hand doesn't need to read a philosophy textbook or debate ethics to decide to help the right hand. It just acts instantaneously because it recognizes the right hand as an inseparable part of the exact same interconnected system.
True compassion is just a spontaneous, effortless reaction to the way reality actually functions when you finally strip away the delusion of separation.
Exactly. Everything is primordially equal and perfect because everything is equally empty and equally intertwined. Which brings us to the ultimate crowning realization of Madhyamaka philosophy, the absolute equivalence of samsara and nirvana.
This is the realization that turns all of conventional religion on its head. Because usually, we treat these as two completely different places.
Absolutely different.
Samsara is the burning building of suffering, the daily grind, the traffic jams, the sickness, the stress. And nirvana is the escape pod, the helicopter waiting on the roof that whisks you away to a pristine, unconditioned, peaceful paradise.
But Nāgārjuna's logic proves irrefutably that there is zero ontological difference between them.
Zero.
You don't escape the burning building of samsara to get to nirvana. Samsara and nirvana are the exact same ontological reality.
Nirvana is simply this exact world, the traffic, the corporate meetings, the oak tables, the spilled coffee, but perceived with wisdom, free from the grasping, free from the exhausting reification of absolute continuity and absolute difference.
You don't change the physical universe, you change your cognitive relationship to it.
You stop trying to freeze the river with your bare hands, and you finally just let it flow.
It is liberation precisely in the midst of the conditions, not an escape from them.
What a breathtaking journey. Let me try to briefly recap the massive arc of what we've covered today because we went incredibly deep.
Please do. Synthesize the steps for us.
We started by taking the patient into the clinic. The deeply ingrained Abhidharma belief in the absolute continuity of the self. The idea that karma requires a solid, inherently real stream or subtle consciousness to travel from the producer to the reaper.
Right.
We took that triad, the actor, the action, the result, and we dropped it into the relentless crucible of the tetralemma. We proved logically that the producer and the reaper cannot be inherently continuous without freezing the universe. They cannot be inherently discontinuous without shattering the universe. They can't be both, and they can't be neither. We completely dissolved the absolute boundaries of the self.
And in the wreckage of that absolute reality, we found the twin engines that actually make life possible.
Emptiness and dependent origination. We found a centerless, infinite fractal loop of causality that functions flawlessly because it is empty. We realized the world is a highly functional karmic echo, from our internal psychological neuroses all the way out to the physical oak table and the laws of gravity.
We applied the generalized tetralemma to all phenomena, leaving no absolute rock unturned.
And we found the middle way, the path of acting conventionally, playing the game of life fiercely, preparing for the meeting, breaking in traffic, but acting without acting, resting in the primordial purity of suchness where compassion flows as naturally and effortlessly as physics.
Beautifully said.
And we realized that the chaotic world of samsara and the perfect peace of nirvana are the exact same space.
A masterful summary of an incredibly rigorous, paradigm-shifting diagnostic process.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought. Something to mull over on your own as you digest all of this dense philosophical machinery.
What's the thought?
We've spent this entire deep dive proving that the actor, the action, and the result are an empty triad. We proved they're a dependently co-arising mirage that only exists in relation to each other.
Yes, the karmic triad is empty.
But I want you to take this universal solvent, this Madhyamaka logic, and I want you to apply it to your visceral experience of time itself. Because time is the ultimate triad, the past, the present, and the future.
Okay,
If the past, present, and future are also just an empty triad lacking any inherent existence, think about what that actually means for your daily suffering. If the past is completely ungraspable, just an illusion that is already gone, existing only as a dependently originated conceptual memory in your current mind. And if the future is entirely unwritten, an illusion dependent on millions of interconnected conditions that haven't even happened yet.
If they lack inherent existence, they vanish as empty phantoms the moment you try to grab them.
Exactly. If the past and the future are empty phantoms, what happens to your crushing, paralyzing anxieties about tomorrow? What happens to your heavy, suffocating regrets about yesterday?
They lose their grip.
If you refuse to reify them, if you realize they have no absolute substance, they dissolve. The present moment is the only illusion you ever actually have to work with.
A profoundly liberating realization to carry out into the world.
So, step out into your primordially perfect day. Go to your high-stakes corporate meetings, drive in the chaotic, gridlocked traffic, grind your beans, and make your morning coffee. Use your conventional tools fully and passionately.
But act without acting.
Exactly. As you do, remember the feeling of that internal instinct that wants to make everything solid. When you look at the world and your mind tries to draw a jagged line, a solid, absolute boundary between you and a stranger, and says, there it is, that's absolute reality.
Catch yourself.
Remember to look closer, step back. Drop the absolute categories and see the magnificent, interconnected echo for what it truly is.